I was born and raised in Virginia, and all my life I thought I understood what friendship, loyalty, and trust really meant, but nothing could have prepared me for the day my entire world turned upside down. The day a woman I once called my closest friend became the very person who ruined my life. And though time has softened the sting of those memories, I still remember every detail as if it happened only yesterday, because the wound she left in my heart was deep and it changed the way I looked at people for many years. But even so, my story is not just one of betrayal and heartbreak. It is also a story of forgiveness, because as hard as it was, I found it in my soul to forgive her, though the journey to that forgiveness was long and full of pain. And I want to tell you every step of it so you understand how a woman like me, who had lost so much, could ever look into the eyes of the one who took it all away and say, "I forgive you." I grew up in a small Virginia town where everybody knew everybody, where Sundays meant church and gossip traveled faster than the wind. And in that little town I had a best friend named Clara. We went to school together, shared secrets, and promised we would always stand by one another no matter what. She was like a sister to me, and for years I believed she was the most loyal person in my life. But little did I know, she was carrying a darkness in her heart that would one day shatter me. When I was a young woman, I fell in love with a man named Thomas. He was tall, charming, and gentle in ways that made me feel safe. We courted the old-fashioned way, with long walks, letters, and stolen kisses under the Virginia moonlight. And when he asked me to be his wife, I felt like I was stepping into a dream. We built our little life together, nothing grand, just a small house, a garden, and dreams of raising a family. And during those years, I leaned on Clara more than ever. She stood by me on my wedding day. She held my hand through my first pregnancy, and she laughed with me during long nights when the baby would not stop crying. She was part of every chapter of my early life, and I never questioned her place in it, but behind the smiles and the laughter, she was hiding something from me, something that would nearly destroy me when it finally came to light. It began with small things, moments I brushed off at first, like the way Clara and Thomas sometimes shared long looks, or how she seemed to always know when he would be home from work. But I ignored it, because how could I suspect my best friend and my husband of anything? They were the two people I trusted most in the world, and trust has a way of blinding us to the truth. So I carried on, never thinking that my life was already unraveling thread by thread. The day I found out was an ordinary afternoon. I had gone to the store for groceries, and when I came home, the house was strangely quiet. I went to put the bags away when I heard laughter from the bedroom. And at first, I thought Thomas had turned on the radio. But when I opened the door, my heart stopped, because there they were, Clara and Thomas, together in a way no friend and no husband should ever be. And the shock of it hit me like a stone to the chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stood there watching the two people I loved most betray me in the cruelest way possible. And when they saw me, the look of guilt and fear on their faces told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a single moment of weakness. It was a secret that had been going on far longer than I ever imagined. I don't remember how I got out of that house. I don't remember walking down the road with tears streaming down my face. I only remember the feeling of my world collapsing around me. Like everything I had built, every promise I had believed in, was crumbling to dust beneath my feet, and I felt like I had lost not just a husband, not just a friend, but also myself, because how could I have been so blind? How could I have given my heart and my trust so freely only to have it torn apart? The weeks after that discovery were some of the darkest days of my life. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and everywhere I went people whispered, because in a small Virginia town, news like that travels fast, and though some pitied me, others judged me, as if I should have seen it coming, as if I had been foolish to trust so deeply. But none of them knew the pain of waking up alone, the pain of explaining to my child why Daddy wasn't coming home, the pain of knowing that the woman who had once held my baby in her arms, was the same woman who had taken everything from me. And for a long time, bitterness grew inside me like a vine, twisting around my heart until I could hardly recognize myself anymore, and I thought I would carry that bitterness to my grave. In the weeks after I discovered the truth, I felt as though I was walking through a fog, every step heavy, every breath difficult, and every thought poisoned by the betrayal I had witnessed with my own eyes. And though people in town continued on with their lives, my world had stopped spinning. Because how does a woman rebuild when the very foundation of her life has been torn away? I remember waking up each morning with a hollow ache in my chest, looking at the bed where Thomas used to sleep, hearing the echoes of laughter that were no longer in my home. And I wondered if I would ever feel whole again, for my heart was not just broken, it was shattered, and I couldn't find the pieces to put it back together. My child was young, too young to understand the storm that had swept through our lives, but even he could sense the sadness that followed me everywhere, and I tried to be strong for him. I tried to smile, to cook, to sing the lullabies I used to sing, but often my voice cracked and the tears would come, and I would sit rocking him in my arms, silently begging God to give me the strength I no longer had. The nights were the hardest because at night the silence seemed to scream, and in that silence I replayed the scene over and over: Clara's face, Thomas's guilt, the look in their eyes when they realized they had been caught, and the more I thought about it, the more anger rose inside me like a fire, burning hotter each day, because betrayal like that doesn't just wound you, it changes you, and I could feel myself becoming someone harder, someone colder, someone I didn't recognize. People told me to hold my head high, to move on, to focus on my child, but those words felt empty when my nights were filled with loneliness and my days were haunted by whispers in the grocery store or stares at church, because everyone knew, and everyone had an opinion, and even though Clara had been the one who wronged me, somehow I carried the weight of shame, as if I had failed, as if I had not been enough for Thomas to stay, and that thought cut deeper than any knife. Clara disappeared from my life for a while after that day. She stayed away from town, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear, but her absence was almost as painful as her presence would have been, because for years she had been my closest friend, and suddenly she was gone, leaving behind an emptiness I couldn't fill. And though I hated her for what she had done, I also missed her, and that contradiction tore at me in ways I didn't understand, because how could I miss someone who had destroyed me? Yet I did, because friendship doesn't just vanish overnight. It lingers like an echo of a song you once loved but can no longer bear to hear. Thomas tried to come back at first. He sent letters, he came to the house, he begged for forgiveness, he swore it had been a mistake, that he loved me, that he couldn't live without me. But the image of him with Clara was burned into my mind like a scar, and no words, no apologies, no promises could erase it, so I turned him away again and again, until finally he stopped coming, and I don't know where he went or what became of him. And for a long time I didn't care, because the man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my heart, no longer existed to me. He was just a stranger who bore the face of someone I once thought I knew. In those dark months, bitterness became my closest companion. I thought about Clara constantly, not in love or longing, but in rage, imagining all the cruel words I would say if she dared to show her face, imagining how I would tell the world what kind of woman she really was, and sometimes even imagining what justice would look like if it were mine to give. And those thoughts consumed me so much that I hardly recognized myself. And one evening, as I sat alone by the fire, my child asleep in his bed, I realized that I was letting her destroy me twice, once by her betrayal, and again by the anger I carried like a stone in my chest. And that thought unsettled me, because I had always been a woman of faith, a woman who believed in love and kindness. And yet here I was bitter and cold, my heart chained to a pain I couldn't let go of. Slowly, I began to see that if I didn't change, if I didn't find a way to release the anger, it would consume me for the rest of my days. And my child would grow up seeing a mother who had let hate define her life. And that was not the legacy I wanted to leave behind. And so, even though I wasn't ready, even though every part of me screamed that it was impossible, I whispered a prayer one night, a small and trembling prayer, asking God to help me forgive, not because Clara deserved it, not because Thomas deserved it, but because I deserved peace, I deserved freedom from the pain that chained me. And from that night forward, though nothing changed instantly, a seed was planted inside me, a seed of forgiveness, fragile and small, but alive. And I knew that if I nurtured it, one day it might grow strong enough to help me reclaim my life. Time has a way of moving forward, even when our hearts feel stuck in place. And as the months passed into years, I found that the sharp edges of my pain began to dull, not disappear, but soften, like a scar that still aches when the weather changes but no longer bleeds. And during that time, my focus shifted more and more to raising my son, because I knew he deserved a childhood filled with love and not shadowed by bitterness. And so I worked hard to create a home for him that was safe and steady. I took in sewing jobs, I cooked meals from scratch, I tended my garden, and I did all the little things that mothers do to make sure their children feel cared for. And though there were nights I cried into my pillow, there were also mornings where his laughter filled the house. And those moments reminded me that even in the ruins of a broken heart, life could still bloom. But Clara lingered in my thoughts, always like a ghost just beyond the corner of my mind. And I wondered often if I would ever see her again, if she would ever dare to come back to town. And I told myself that if she did, I would be ready to face her. Yet deep down I feared that old anger might rise again and undo the little bit of peace I had begun to find. So I carried that quiet dread with me like a shadow. Years went by. My son grew taller. His little hands became strong enough to help me in the garden. His voice deepened, and his questions grew harder. And sometimes he would ask about his father, about why he had gone. And I would answer as gently as I could, telling him only that his father had made choices that took him away, but that none of it was his fault. And though I tried to speak without bitterness, I knew my boy could feel the weight in my voice, because children always sense more than we think. And I prayed every night that he would not inherit the hurt I carried, that he would grow into a man who loved truly and stood by his promises. Then one afternoon, when I least expected it, Clara returned. It was at the market in town. I had gone to sell some vegetables and quilts, and as I stood behind my table arranging jars of preserves, I felt a chill run through me. And when I looked up there, she was older, thinner, her eyes downcast, but it was her, as sure as the sun rising, and for a moment I could not breathe. It was as if all those years melted away, and I was right back in that bedroom doorway, my heart breaking all over. Again, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep myself steady. She must have felt my stare, because she lifted her head, and our eyes met. And in that instant I saw something I had never seen in her before, a kind of weariness, a sorrow that seemed carved into her face, and though my heart still burned with the memory of what she had done, I also felt a strange flicker of pity, because she no longer looked like the confident friend I had once adored, nor the reckless woman who had stolen my husband. She looked like someone who had been carrying her own burden all these years. And in that flicker of pity, I realized that betrayal had not only destroyed me, it had also left its mark on her. She approached slowly, her hands trembling, and when she reached me, she whispered my name, almost like a prayer, and for a long moment neither of us spoke further, just stood there in the noise of the market, two women bound together by a past neither of us could escape. And finally she said, "I am sorry," her voice breaking on the words, and though I had imagined that apology 1,000 times in my head, hearing it in real life was different. It was raw and fragile, and it pierced through me. in a way I hadn't expected, because suddenly I understood that for all my anger, for all my hatred, I had also longed for this moment, for some acknowledgement that the pain she caused me had mattered. But forgiveness is not a switch you flip, it is a mountain you climb. And as I stood there looking into her weary eyes, I knew I wasn't ready to give her what she asked for, not yet. So I told her I had no words for her then, and I turned away, leaving her standing alone in the crowd. And though my steps were steady, my heart was trembling, because that brief encounter had awakened something inside me, a stirring of the seed I had planted years ago when I prayed for the strength to forgive. And, though the anger still lived within me, I could feel the faintest stirring of compassion, like the first green shoot breaking through the hard soil of winter. In the weeks that followed, I thought of Clara constantly, not in rage as before, but in wonder, because I realized that she too must have suffered, she too must have carried shame, and though it did not erase what she had done, it reminded me that she was human, flawed and broken just as I was, and slowly, little by little, the tightness in my chest began to ease, and I found myself praying not only for my own healing, but also for hers, and that was the beginning of something new, the faintest step toward forgiveness, a step I never thought I would be able to take. After that day at the market, I thought often about Clara. Her face haunted my dreams, and her trembling voice echoed in my ears. And though I told myself I wanted nothing more to do with her, I could not shake the image of the woman I had seen. Not the Clara of my youth, not the Clara who had smiled at me on my wedding day, nor the Clara who had stolen my husband, but a Clara who looked weary, broken, and aged by a sorrow I could not name. And that image unsettled me because for so long I had pictured her as a villain, the source of my pain, the woman who ruined my life. But now I had seen her humanity, and it was much harder to cling to hatred when compassion had begun to stir in me like a quiet whisper. And still I resisted, because anger is a heavy thing, but it is familiar, and sometimes we cling to what is familiar even when it poisons us, because letting go feels too much like losing control. Weeks passed, and once again fate placed Clara in my path, this time at church on a Sunday morning. I hadn't seen her there since before the betrayal, and when she walked in, heads turned, whispers spread across the pews, and I could feel the tension in the air because everyone remembered what had happened between us. Small towns never forget. And as she sat quietly in the back pew, I tried to focus on the hymns, on the sermon, but I felt her presence behind me like a weight pressing on my shoulders. And when the service ended and the congregation spilled out into the sunlight, there she was again, waiting at the steps, her eyes searching the crowd until they found mine. And once more she approached me, her steps hesitant, her hands clutching one another as if in prayer, and she asked me again for forgiveness, her voice louder this time, but still fragile. And I felt the eyes of the whole town upon us, waiting to see how I would respond. For a long moment, I said nothing, the memories flashing through me like lightning, the laughter from that bedroom, the years of loneliness, the tears I had shed, and my heart screamed to turn away, to shield myself from the past. But another voice within me whispered that this was the very moment I had prayed for, the chance to release the weight I had carried for so long. And though I was not yet ready to forgive, I did not turn her away this time. I told her simply that forgiveness is a journey, not a word to be spoken quickly, and that though I had not yet reached that place, I was trying. And she wept when she heard me say it, because even that small mercy was more than she believed she deserved. And for the first time in years, I felt a strange lightness in my chest, as if by admitting I was on the path, I had already taken one step toward freedom. After that Sunday, we began to cross paths more often, sometimes by chance, sometimes because she lingered where she knew I might be, at the market, at church, by the post office, and though at first I bristled, I soon realized she was not trying to force my forgiveness. She was only trying to show me that she had changed, that she was no longer the woman who once betrayed me, and slowly I began to listen. We shared short conversations, at first about simple things like the weather or the crops. But eventually she told me about her life after Thomas, how things had not worked out as she had dreamed, how he had left her too, chasing another woman in another town, leaving her with nothing but shame and regret. And though I wanted to feel satisfaction in her suffering, instead I felt sorrow, because in her story I heard echoes of my own, the same loneliness, the same abandonment, and I realized that betrayal had come full circle to her as well, and that life had its own way of balancing the scales without me needing to lift a hand. It was not easy, dear, not by any means, for each time I saw her I felt the old wounds ache. But little by little, compassion began to weave itself through the cracks of my bitterness, and I started to understand that forgiveness was not about excusing her actions or pretending the pain had not happened, but about choosing not to let that pain rule my life any longer, choosing to lay it down and walk forward free. One afternoon, years after the day that broke me, I invited Clara to sit with me in the garden, the very garden where my son and I had worked so many seasons together, where flowers bloomed again each spring no matter how harsh the winter. And as we sat there among the blossoms, I told her of my hurt. I spoke the words I had held inside me for so long, the betrayal, the loneliness, the shame, and she listened with tears streaming down her face, never interrupting, never defending herself, only listening. And when I had finished, when the last of my pain had been spoken aloud into the open air, she reached for my hand and whispered again that she was sorry, truly sorry, and for the first time I believed her. For the first time I felt the truth in her voice, and in that moment I realized I had a choice to hold on to the pain and let it define me, or to release it and let myself finally heal. And though every part of me trembled, I whispered back the words I never thought I would say. I forgive you. When the words left my lips, when I told Clara that I forgave her, it felt as though a weight I had been carrying for half my life suddenly slipped from my shoulders. It was not a loud or dramatic moment. No one else was there to see it, but the two of us sitting quietly in the garden. Yet to me, it was as though the heavens themselves had opened, and I could finally breathe a deep and steady breath for the first time in years. And I remember closing my eyes and feeling the wind brush against my cheek, gentle and cool, as if the world was reminding me that life was still here, waiting for me, and that I no longer had to live bound to the past. And when I looked at Clara, she was weeping, her hands clutching mine like they were lifelines, and in her eyes I saw something I had never seen before, not even when we were children, a raw and humble gratitude, as though my forgiveness had given her a chance to be human again. And in that moment, I understood that forgiveness was not just for me. It was also for her, because for all those years she had been carrying her own burden of shame, and my words had lifted some of that as well. Still, forgiveness did not mean forgetting, nor did it mean that we could return to the friendship we once had, because some wounds heal but leave scars, and I knew I would always carry the memory of her betrayal. But the difference was that now the memory no longer ruled me. It no longer burned like fire in my chest. Instead, it was like a stone lying quietly at the bottom of a river, smoothed by time, present but no longer sharp, and that was enough for me. After that day, Clara and I began to speak more often, not as best friends, not as we had been when we were young, but as two women who had walked through pain and come out on the other side with a kind of understanding that few people ever reach. We shared small moments, sitting together after church, talking in the market, and sometimes even walking down the lane as the sun set. And though we never spoke again of Thomas, never reopened the wound of what had been lost, there was a quiet honesty between us, a recognition of the past and an acceptance of the present, and in its own way it was healing. My son, who was grown by then, noticed a change in me. He told me one evening as we sat on the porch that I seemed lighter, as though some shadow had finally lifted. And he asked me if I had truly forgiven the woman who had once hurt us both so deeply. And I told him yes, I had, and he looked at me with a kind of awe, because forgiveness is not easy to understand until you've walked the road of bitterness yourself. And I wanted him to know that forgiveness was not weakness, it was strength. Perhaps the greatest strength of all, because it meant I chose not to let pain rule me. And I hoped he would carry that lesson into his own life, that he would know the power of letting go and choosing peace. As the years continued to pass, Clara and I grew older. Our hair turned gray, our faces lined with time, and though we would never again be the girls who once whispered secrets under the stars, we found a quiet companionship in our later years, one built not on innocence but on truth, and there were days I almost marveled at it, because had you told the younger me, the broken me, that I would one day sit beside the woman who ruined my life and feel peace instead of anger, I would have laughed bitterly and said it was impossible. Yet here I was, living proof that forgiveness can transform even the deepest wounds. I learned something precious through it all. Dear, something I wish every person could know, and it is this. Forgiveness is not about saying what happened was right. It is not about erasing the pain or pretending it did not happen. It is about choosing not to let that pain define you any longer, about loosening your grip on anger so you can open your hands to life again. Because when you hold on to bitterness, it is like carrying a burning coal, hoping it will hurt the one who wronged you. But all it does is burn you instead. And when I let go, when I forgave, I set myself free, and that freedom was worth every trembling step it took to get there. And as for Clara, I believe she found her own kind of peace too. She never rebuilt her life in the way she once dreamed. She never had a family of her own, and perhaps that was her sorrow to carry. But she found comfort in small things, in tending her flowers, in helping neighbors, in singing in the choir again. And though her life was not what it might have been, I like to think that my forgiveness gave her the chance to live out her days without drowning in regret. And perhaps that was a kind of redemption for her. Looking back now, I see that my story is not just about betrayal and loss. It is about resilience, about faith, about the incredible power of the human heart to heal even when it has been shattered. And I tell it not because I want sympathy, but because I want others to know that no matter how deep the wound, forgiveness is possible, and it can set you free in ways you cannot even imagine. And that, dear, is why I chose to forgive the woman who ruined my life. As the years drifted on and the seasons turned one after another, I often found myself reflecting on how far I had come since those dark days when betrayal was fresh and my heart felt like it could never heal. And it astonished me sometimes to realize that the woman I had once feared to face, the woman whose name alone once filled me with bitterness, had now become a part of my life again, not as a best friend as she once was, but as a quiet companion whose presence reminded me every day of the power of forgiveness. And it was not lost on me that many people in our little Virginia town never understood it. They whispered still, some saying I was foolish to ever speak to her again, others shaking their heads at the sight of us sitting side by side after church or walking together down the lane. And I knew they could not understand, for it is easy to hold on to anger. It is easy to demand punishment and justice, but it takes something deeper, something almost divine, to look into the eyes of the one who wronged you and see not an enemy, but a broken soul in need of grace. And I had chosen grace because I knew what bitterness had once done to me, and I refused to let it claim me again. As I grew older, I began to cherish the quieter rhythms of life, mornings on the porch with my coffee, afternoons in the garden tending the flowers, evenings listening to the crickets sing beneath the Virginia sky. And in many of those moments, Clara was there too, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories of her younger years, sometimes simply keeping me company, and I found that our companionship in those later years, though strange to outsiders, was healing to me because it reminded me every day of the strength it took to forgive and of the peace that came from that choice. My son, who had grown into a fine man with a family of his own, often brought his children to visit, and he would watch with quiet wonder as Clara sat with us, as though even after all the years he still could not quite believe that I had chosen this path. And once he asked me again, this time as a grown man, how I had managed to forgive her, and I told him the truth, that it was not one moment, not one prayer, but 1,000 little choices made day by day. Each time I set down my anger instead of picking it back up. Each time I looked at her and chose to see a human being instead of a villain. Each time I remembered that carrying hate would only chain me. And in teaching him this, I hoped he would understand that forgiveness is not weakness, but courage. That it is not letting someone off the hook, but letting yourself off the chain. And I could see in his eyes that he was learning, and that perhaps one day in his own trials he would remember. In those later years, Clara too softened. Her laugh grew gentler, her voice quieter, and she often told me how grateful she was that I had not turned her away, how much it meant to her to be allowed to sit beside me in peace after all she had done. And though I never said it out loud, I too was grateful, because through her presence I was daily reminded that God's grace can take even the ugliest parts of our lives and weave them into something meaningful, and that even broken relationships can bloom again, not as they once were, but in a new and unexpected way. Sometimes when we walked together, people would still stare or whisper, and I would smile to myself, because I knew they would never understand the quiet triumph in my heart, the victory of having chosen peace over anger, love over hate, healing over bitterness. And I did not need their approval, for I knew within myself what a miracle it was to sit beside her without pain, and that was enough. As age crept upon us both, our bodies grew weaker, our steps slower, but our conversations grew deeper, filled with memories of the lives we had lived, the mistakes we had made, the lessons we had learned, and I often marveled at how far we had come. Two women who once stood on opposite sides of betrayal, now walking together into old age with a strange and quiet bond. And I realized then that forgiveness had not only healed my past, it had shaped my present and my future, allowing me to live out my later years in peace rather than in bitterness. And so, dear, when I look back on my life, on all the hardships and joys, the betrayals and blessings, I see clearly that forgiveness was one of the greatest gifts I ever gave myself. For without it, I would have grown old with a heavy heart, bitter and closed. But with it, I grew old, lighter, freer, able to look at the world and my family with love instead of pain. And that is the legacy I wish to leave, that no matter how deep the wound, forgiveness is possible, and it can bring you a peace that nothing else in this world can. As I sit here in the twilight of my years, with my hair white as cotton and my hands lined with the marks of time, I find myself looking back over the long road of my life, and what strikes me most is not the betrayals or the heartbreaks, though they were sharp and nearly broke me, but the ways in which love, faith, and forgiveness lifted me up and carried me through. And if there is one truth I have come to understand, it is that forgiveness is not just an act we do for others. It is a gift we give ourselves, a key that unlocks the prison of anger and bitterness and allows our hearts to be free again. And though it took me many long years to learn this, I know now that it was the most important lesson of my life. When I think back to that day when I first discovered Clara's betrayal, I remember the searing pain, the disbelief, the feeling that my world had ended, and in many ways it had, for the life I knew was gone, the trust one held shattered, the home I dreamed of broken. But life is not just the ending of one chapter. It is also the beginning of another, and what I once thought would destroy me became the very thing that taught me the depth of my own strength and the power of my faith. Clara and I grew old together in that small Virginia town, not as best friends as we once were in our youth, but as companions who had learned through suffering and forgiveness what it means to be human. And in those later years, we laughed together at simple things. We cried together when sorrow came, and we supported one another as our steps slowed and our bodies weakened. And though others never understood, we did not need them to, because what we shared was beyond the eyes of gossip and judgment. It was something forged in the fire of betrayal and refined in the grace of forgiveness, and that made it unshakable in its own quiet way. There were moments, of course, when memories still pricked my heart, times when a smell or a song or a place brought back the ache of what had been lost, but those memories no longer ruled me. They were part of me, yes, but they no longer chained me, and that was the freedom I had found in forgiveness. My son grew into a man of great kindness, a husband, a father, and I like to believe that the lesson he watched me live shaped him too, because I saw in him a gentleness, a patience, a willingness to let go of grudges that reminded me of what I had tried to teach him through my own story. And as I watched him raise his children, my grandchildren, I prayed that the example I set would carry on into their lives, that they too would learn that forgiveness is not weakness, but strength, that it does not erase justice, but it creates peace, and that peace is worth more than all the bitterness in the world. Now, as I sit on my porch in the golden light of evening, the Virginia hills rolling out before me, I often whisper a quiet thank you to the Lord for guiding me down the path of forgiveness, for giving me the strength to release what once bound me, for showing me that even the deepest wounds can heal. And I think of Clara often, of the laughter we shared in childhood, of the pain we walked through in middle age, and of the quiet companionship of our later years. And I know that though she once ruined my life, she also became part of the lesson that shaped me, and for that, strangely enough, I am grateful. Dear, if I could leave you with one piece of wisdom from my long life, it would be this: do not let bitterness take root in your heart, for it will strangle the joy out of your days. Instead, when life wounds you, when people betray you, when you are hurt so deeply you think you will never rise again, hold on, breathe, pray, and when the time is right, choose forgiveness, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace, because your heart deserves to be light again, and because in forgiving you give yourself the freedom to live fully, to love again, and to leave this world not with anger in your chest, but with peace in your soul. And so my story, though born out of betrayal and heartbreak, ends not in bitterness, but in grace, not in anger, but in peace. And I hope that when my grandchildren, and perhaps even their children, remember me, they will not remember the woman who was betrayed, but the woman who forgave, the woman who chose to live with love in her heart even when it had been broken, the woman who proved that forgiveness can turn even the darkest chapters of our lives into stories of hope, and that is the legacy I wish to leave behind in this small Virginia town, a legacy of grace, a legacy of strength, and above all, a legacy of forgiveness.